Despite some similarities to other South American countries, Suriname's story has followed a pattern quite distinct to its neighbors, becoming one of the most multicultural and multi-ethnic places in the Americas. To see why, join me for this brief look at the history of Suriname. Suriname has been inhabited since at least 3000 BCE. Some of the earliest evidence of this comes from Huerepai, the largest archaeological site in the country, known for its pre-Columbian petroglyphs. Prior to the arrival of the Europeans, there were a number of peoples that lived there, including the Arawak, the Caribs, and the Suriname, who gave the country its name. The largest of these were the Arawak, a coastal nomadic tribe that lived off of hunting and fishing, but were soon displaced by the Caribs along the coast, an aggressive people that moved east from the mouth of the Orinoco River. The Suriname, meanwhile, did not stick around and eventually migrated elsewhere in the Guianas. The Spanish were the first Europeans to explore the area. Under the command of Alonso de Ojeda and Americo Vespucci, they sailed along the coast in 1499. There was a follow-up expedition in 1500 under the leadership of Vicente Yáñez Pinzón, but no settlements were attempted until the first half of the 17th century. Massive native resistance, however, made the area lack economic appeal. It was not until Sir Walter Raleigh's exploration of the area and his exaggerated claims about the myth of El Dorado that the Guianas received renewed interest. At first, El Dorado was thought to be located in present-day Colombia or Venezuela, but gradually the focus shifted to the east, and in the early 17th century, even the source of the Maroons River, now the border between Suriname and French Guiana, was explored in the quest of gold. This brought sporadic settlements, mostly undertaken as independent patronships. One of those was a village the Dutch called Paramaribo, after its original inhabitants, a tribe whose own name derived from the words of the Tupi-Guarani language, para, meaning sea or large river, and maribo, or inhabitants. As more and more Europeans settled along the coast, however, relations with the native Amerindian population became strained, and the settlements all failed as a result of native resistance. It was not until 1651 that the British established the first permanent settlement around the remains of Paramaribo, a fort they named Willoughby, where the Europeans intended to establish a new sugar colony as an alternative to Barbados. The original British colonists included experienced planters from Barbados that were soon joined by Sephardic Jewish planters from Cayenne and Sephardic Jewish refugees from Brazil. The latter came after the Portuguese defeated the Dutch at the Battle of Guararapes in 1649, which brought an end to Dutch occupation in Brazil. In February 1667, while the British Crown and the Netherlands were at war, the Dutch conquered the colony under the command of Abraham Crainse and changed the name from Willoughby to Zeelandia. Less than 6 months later, the British and the Dutch negotiated the Treaty of Breda, an agreement that recognized their respective war gains, which included New Netherland, now New York, for the British, and Suriname for the Dutch. In 1674, after yet another war between the two, the Treaty of Westminster made the swap permanent, leading Suriname to be under control of the Netherlands for roughly the next 3 centuries. In the meantime, in 1683, Dutch colonization efforts were reorganized with the creation of the Society of Suriname, a private company that had only 3 shareholders, equal in rights and cost contributions: the City of Amsterdam, the Dutch West India Company, and the family of Cornelis van Arsene van Sommelsdijk, a Dutch lord. Van Arsene then became the governor of the colony, arriving in Paramaribo that same year. He immediately set out to encourage migration to the colony and was successful in making peace with the Amerindians. He also brought additional soldiers to impose order in Suriname. Unfortunately for him, unhappiness with their salary and rations led them to mutiny and shot him dead in 1688. The colony would continue to prosper in the 18th century with the production of sugar, coffee, cocoa, and cotton, all of which was sent back to Europe through Amsterdam. As in much of the Americas, the workforce behind the success were kidnapped Africans, given that the original inhabitants had either died or fled into the jungle, and Suriname became connected to the Atlantic slave trade. By the mid-18th century, the colony had 500 plantations, and in 1787, approximately 50,000 inhabitants, 90% of whom were enslaved people. Given their conditions, these individuals fled at the first opportunity, creating free black communities in the interior of the country. Known as Maroons, or Bacabusi Negre, they would raid plantations from time to time to free other enslaved people, particularly women, and to acquire what they could, especially goods that would be hard to get otherwise. This process created a number of powerful Maroon leaders, such as Bokili Fuboni, a man born in Kotika to an enslaved African mother who died fighting the Dutch in 1793, and whose descendants, the Aluku, are now a recognized ethnic group in French Guiana. Two opposing tactics were employed by the planters to eliminate the threat posed by the Maroons: a resort to arms as well as the ratification of peace treaties with the Nyucas and the Saramacas in 1761 and 1762 respectively. The Maroon attacks had shaken the economic confidence in Suriname, while a financial crisis in the Amsterdam stock market, which stopped the money flow to the colony, did the rest. The latter was particularly destructive for the colony's plantations because their prosperity was largely based on credit. The estate served as security, and in most cases the value of these securities was lower than the amount of the loans. Moreover, this easy money was often spent on luxury goods rather than on the plantation itself. As a result, most of the plantations fell into the possession of creditors who left the daily management of the estates to administrators in Paramaribo. This absentee ownership made things worse. Short-term interests led to the exhaustion of the soil, machinery, and the labor force. Calm was restored finally in 1790, and new plantations were founded to the west of Paramaribo along the Saramacca, Nickerie, and Coroni rivers. These plantations were often owned by colonists of English and Scottish descent. The false prosperity in the last decades of the 18th century led to a brief flourishing in the cultural life in Paramaribo. A leisure class had the time and money to spend on literature, theater, and science. The first newspaper began publication, and a communal theater was built. The Napoleonic Wars brought new disruptions. In 1795, revolutionary France invaded the Netherlands and created the Batavian Republic, making it a client state. As a result, the Dutch colonies in the Americas were occupied by the British off and on, starting in 1799 until 1816, when after the defeat of Napoleon, Suriname was returned to the Dutch, while the British kept Guyana. These years of English interim government led to economic deterioration. The disruption of trade made it virtually impossible to sell products in Europe or to import enslaved people. This then became a legal requirement when Britain abolished the slave trade in 1808. Thus, when the Dutch regained Suriname, they found that the number of plantations had been reduced dramatically. The poor economic conditions would continue and then worsen even further in the next few decades. In 1821 and 1832, fires burnt down large parts of Paramaribo, and after 1844, the government in The Hague had to make up the budget deficits in the colony. Although the end of the slave trade forced the planters to improve the conditions of those already enslaved, the abolition of slavery itself was not seriously considered until 1853, and even then, it still took another decade for the Dutch Parliament to actually abolish it. The abolition law that passed in 1863 arranged for the government to pay 300 guilders in compensation to the planters for every enslaved person released. However, although technically there were now 33,000 newly freed people, the law also decreed a 10-year period of state supervision, which included mandatory contract work by the former slaves for a planter of their choice. This system provided a means of peaceful transition from slavery to free labor and guaranteed the planters an adequate supply of labor for some years. Still, those formerly enslaved had to be replaced somehow, and a number of groups were brought in to do that. First, there were Chinese and Portuguese from the island of Madeira, who first came to the colony in 1853. Then there were Indian indentured laborers, who began arriving in Suriname in 1873 and stopped altogether in 1914. And finally, in 1890, there were people from Java in the Dutch East Indies, future Indonesia. Of the 34,000 British Indian laborers who came to Suriname on a contract basis, 1/3 returned, and of the 33,000 Javanese, approximately 1/4 did. Following the abolition of slavery, Suriname also experienced a number of economic changes. For one, sugar began to lose importance. During the decade of state supervision of labor, it represented 80% of the total value of exports. By the following decade, it receded to 50% and continued to decline to between 20 and 30% by the beginning of World War I. The Great Depression caused yet another sharp downfall, and by 1939, only 6% of the total value of exports was derived from sugar products. The reason for this was mainly outside Suriname's control. This included the opening of the Suez Canal, which facilitated trade with East Asia, the imposition of preferential tariffs in Europe, and competition from beet sugar. This led to only a few large states remaining viable. Of the 87 sugar plantations that were registered in 1860, there were only 4 remaining in operation in 1940, which managed to keep production going at the pre-emancipation level, despite the severe problems posed by the rapidly declining price of the product. Economic crisis within the sugar industry had a disastrous effect on the economy as a whole because of the overwhelming predominance of that commodity. Yet, total collapse was always avoided by temporary resort to alternatives such as tropical products, gold, and bauxite. Gold mining started in the 1870s in the Lawa area, and the colonial administration fostered this activity by granting favorable concessions and by promoting the building of a railway from Paramaribo to Lawa. When construction was finished in 1912, however, the production of gold was already in decline. In 1915, bauxite deposits were found by an American geologist. This discovery gained particular importance during the First World War, and in 1917, the Suriname Bauxite Company, an American enterprise, started production. By the 1930s, bauxite had become the country's primary export, retaining this title well into the 21st century. The Great Depression of the 1930s, however, hit the country hard, and soon led to unemployment, social unrest, and political resistance. In 1931, for example, Paramaribo was the scene of riots which were violently suppressed by the police. There was also the rise of an important anti-colonialist leader, Anton de Kom, a Creole activist born in Paramaribo. De Kom had developed substantive popular support, and in January 1933, the government arrested him in an attempt to curb his influence. In response, a crowd of his supporters assembled to demand his release, and despite warnings, the police killed 2 demonstrators and wounded several others. This tragedy put an end to the active protest against the administration, and de Kom was ultimately deported. While World War II brought a brief economic boom, it also accelerated an independence process for the colony, something which had been a long time coming. In 1866, a new constitution that provided a certain measure of autonomy through a system known as colonial stat was established. But this assembly had a merely supervisory function. In 1948, talks about Suriname's internal political autonomy began in earnest. This resulted first in the first full election in 1949, and then in self-government in 1954 under the Charter of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which officially divided the Dutch polity into 3 equal and autonomous partners: the Netherlands, Suriname, and the Netherland Antilles, and was intended to pave the way for the independence of all overseas territories. Universal suffrage was also granted in 1950, which led to the development of political parties, all of which were organized on an ethnic basis. The most important were the NPS, or National Party of Suriname, for the light-skinned Creole elite, the PSV, or Progressive Suriname People's Party, for the working-class Creoles, the VHP, or Progressive Reformational Party, for the British Indians, and the KTPI, or Party of National Unity and Solidarity, for the Javanese. The enthusiasm for the charter as an ingenious and progressive arrangement of post-colonial affairs soon waned, however. The NPS in particular wanted an autonomous foreign policy for Suriname, while the VHP objected to such a modification of the charter. This conflict between the Creoles and British Indians on the political development of Suriname continued until 1975. The former called for political independence by arguing that it was a prerequisite for economic independence, while the latter argued that economic stability was the precondition for political sovereignty. Yet, because coalition cabinets of Creoles and British Indians governed Suriname from 1958 to 1973, relations with the Dutch government did not change. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, support for the independence of the overseas territories was growing. In 1969, riots in both Suriname and Curaçao revealed great social and political tensions. In the latter case, the charter compelled the Dutch military to intervene in the conflict, which not only damaged relations with the kingdom, but also seemed to shatter the liberal Dutch image abroad. A final and more practical motive for the Netherlands to amend the charter was the mass migration of Surinamese to the Dutch metropole. Thousands of Surinamese fled the unstable socioeconomic situation in their country, but on arrival in the Netherlands, they found a declining Dutch economy caused by the growing competition for housing and jobs. And since these migrants had the same rights as Dutch citizens, they put a strain on the social security system. Thus, both the Dutch and the Surinamese governments concluded that the independence of Suriname would be the only solution to halt the migration and rebuild the reputation of the Netherlands abroad. In 1973, the Creole-dominated government headed by Henk Aron declared that Suriname would withdraw from the Kingdom of the Netherlands before 1976, despite the fact that Prime Minister Aron's cabinet enjoyed only the smallest majority in parliament and that the largest opposition party, the British Indian VHP, rejected sovereignty. His government managed to declare the country independent on November 25th. The new sovereignty did not damage relations with the Netherlands, however. For one thing, there was a lot of collaboration between the two countries in defense and foreign affairs, and for another, there was a multi-annual development plan which granted 35 billion guilders in development aid to be spent in Suriname in the next 10 to 15 years. Thus, although Suriname had become an independent republic, the assistance of the Netherlands remained instrumental in shaping the development of the country. Things would soon become rocky, however. On February 25, 1980, after the government's refusal to sanction trade union activity within the armed forces, a group of non-commissioned army officers led by Bouterse seized the government. Now known as the Sergeant's Coup, it was initially welcomed by most of the population, as they hoped the armed forces would improve the economy and put an end to corruption. The military then installed a national council which promptly imposed an evening curfew, closed down most newspapers, declared that Suriname would return to democracy within 2 years, and called on the moderate wing of the PNR to form a cabinet composed mostly of civilians. Far from improving economic matters, however, the new regime made things worse, as foreign aid was suspended, private foreign investment stagnated, and export of bauxite further declined. As de facto military rule radicalized, a revolutionary front was created with the intention of establishing a socialist state, which in turn increased opposition from trade unions, business associations, and professional groups. In response, in December 1982, the military government kidnapped the 15 most prominent opposition leaders and took them to Fort Zeeland, where they were tortured and executed, a traumatic event now known as the December Murders. The Netherlands and the United States immediately suspended aid, but the military remained in power, and within a few years the country would be enmeshed in a civil war. This was because in July 1986, Roenie Brunswick, a former bodyguard of Bouterse, unhappy with his rule, began attacking military posts with his Jungle Commando, a Maroon guerrilla group originally formed for military deserters. The government reacted harshly, destroying most of their villages and forcing them to flee into French Guiana. But as the politics and the economy continued to deteriorate, the military allowed elections to take place. In 1987, a civilian government was elected, but after it began negotiating a peace treaty with the Jungle Commando, the armed forces once again deposed it in a bloodless coup in 1990. But things had changed, and after massive international pressure, the military was once again forced to give up power. Another civilian government led by Ronald Venetian was elected in 1991 and signed a peace treaty with the Jungle Commando and other armed bands in 1992. Venetian would go on to democratically rule Suriname until 2010, with the exception of Jules Weidenbach's 4-year term between 1996 and 2000. Since 1991, Suriname has remained a democracy, but not without problems. In particular, along with widening social and economic inequalities, a vast criminal economy revolving around drug trafficking and gold smuggling has developed. The other big issue is that its economy has been hit hard by falling international commodity prices, leading the government to try to diversify the economy with a new focus on developing tourism, with mixed results. Meanwhile, the country has had trouble holding Desi Bouterse accountable for his years as dictator. This was in part because he retained a significant political base in the country. The party he founded in 1987, for example, the NDP, or National Democratic Party, has won at least a quarter of the seats in parliament in every election since 1991, except for 2000, when it only managed 13%. As a result, although a trial over the December murders began in 2007, he was not convicted of it until December 2023, when he was sentenced to 20 years in jail. This after an amnesty law that passed in 2012, which his supporters believe should have ended the trial, multiple appeals in 2019 and 2021, and Bouterse's own rule as democratically elected president between 2010 and 2020. The current president is Chan Santokhi, a man who as a police commissioner investigated the December murders and then as a justice minister pushed the case to go ahead. As Suriname continues to consolidate its democracy, new oil discoveries and a moderate economic recovery has given its citizens hope. But whether Suriname has truly transitioned to a better future is still an open question.